Well, I think Jersey has an incredibly exciting future that is packed with opportunity, and I think collaboration with Digital Jersey and with the tech community is becoming so important for companies like ours.
If we're going to bring the humanity back into medicine, increase the time that humans are spending with humans, then we have to get rid of a lot of the tasks that they're currently doing and are bad at doing, and computers are better at doing. And that's where we're going with the digital delivery strategy.
A very good afternoon and welcome back to Jersey Tech Week. I hope you are well. If you've been following us through, we're into session 4 of this Tuesday afternoon. If you're watching back, goodness knows where we are, because there has been so much to chew over and choose from over the past day and a half, and this afternoon is no exception. Let me tell you a little bit about the plan of action for the course of this afternoon, because we've got a big focus on AI, and here's what is in store for you. Today, AI and deep learning, and a very special set of guests to look at how this is benefiting the industry, beginning with a panel being led by Professor Dame Wendy Hall, looking at some of the theories and some of the ethics behind this technology. And then an hour later at 4 o'clock, we'll be having another panel led by Tom Hacquoil, who'll be looking at some of the practical applications of this technology and how this is being used now, how the events of the past few months have fast forwarded that, and indeed their expectations of how that technology could be transformed in the coming weeks and months as well. This morning, I'll tell you what, I just want to say thank you. We've had so much positive feedback about our look back on COVID-19 and how Jersey has responded through technology in education, government and private industry as well. If you check out any of the Digital Jersey social media channels, whether that's on Facebook, on Twitter, or on LinkedIn, you will find a ton of content and a really good debate underway as well right now. In fact, if you just search the hashtag Jersey Tech Week, you will get all of that. But I want to introduce you to someone very special. I was very unsure, quite frankly, Dame Wendy, how properly to introduce you, because the list of titles I could throw your way goes off the scale. So I'm simply going to go with tech legend, and I know you have lined us up with a stellar panel. You can go with that faux reaction all you like, Dame Wendy, but it is more than hard-earned. Dame Wendy, over to you to introduce your panel, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you, Gary. And I've got a lot of echo. I'll live with tech legend. That's cool. That's absolutely cool. I don't want this panel to be about me. I want it to be about the panelists and the discussion we're going to have. Just by the way, I've been having a back chat with Kelly, and we do want to do Q&A with the audience, even though we won't be able to see the questions ourselves. So please do, Gary, if that's all right with you. I think they're going to ask the audience 4 questions using whatever system you're using. And Gary, if you would pick some for us to try at the end.
That would be my absolute pleasure. I will curate to the best of my ability, but give me a wide eye if they are widely off topic. I will throw those to you and your panel over the next 45 minutes or so.
Gary, that's super. And we have the right, of course, to refuse to answer a question or to say it's too boring or too difficult to whatever. Anyway, I want to get on and introduce my panel. We're going to take this as a conversation, but I hope they're going to tell you a lot about what they do and what they think about AI and how it's contributing to the world. Just to make a little preface, I am the only one of the panel, I think, who's actually been to Jersey. I believe that's the case. Jennifer, you haven't visited yet, have you?
I have not yet.
No. So we have the question about how can AI help Jersey is a little hard for us to answer. I have the privilege of being on the Digital Jersey board. I've only been on the board for about 3 months, though, and since that time, I haven't been able to travel to Jersey. And I heard the Condor ferry is just being suspended for the winter. So there's another, although Flybe may be back again, who knows? So you may be, and I have to say, sitting in the UK today, where we're waiting for Boris Johnson to talk to us again at 5 o'clock, is a little not a particularly pleasant experience at the moment. We're all a bit worried about what's happening, and I don't know what it's like in the US, but I imagine you have that and other things to worry about, Jennifer, at the moment.
Yes, very similar.
So we look fondly on Jersey and how well you've done during COVID, and I know some of the work that Digital Jersey did to help make that happen, and they should be congratulated on that. Okay, so over to our panelists. I am joined by Professor Michael Wooldridge, Professor Jennifer Fischer, and Paul Clarke. I can't remember, Paul, if you've got an academic title or not, but he has an honour. Yes, it doesn't matter. Let's not go into what titles and honours we've got, but Paul is well known for his work in industry and AI, and I'm going to introduce them in turn and ask them to give their perspectives initially on what is AI. And I'm going to start with Michael, who's a professor at Oxford. He's head of department of computer science at Oxford and someone who truly is an AI professor. Michael, do you want to say a little bit more about what you do? And then you have written 2 wonderful books about AI. You should tell us what they are and tell us what AI is in your opinion.
Okay, so, well, thank you for the invitation to be here. So my name is Mike Wooldridge, and as Wendy says, I'm a professor of computer science at Oxford and head of department of computer science at Oxford. I'm also one of the programme directors for AI at the Alan Turing Institute in London, which is the UK's national centre for AI and data science. So Wendy's heard this joke before, so I apologise to Wendy, but it's a good joke, so I don't really apologise for telling it again. So I've been an AI researcher for 30 years, and it's all I've ever done. That's been my life. And for most of that time, it was a nice, quiet existence. Nobody bothered me. I didn't bother anybody else. I just got on with my research and published my papers and applied for my grants and so on. And then something weird happened about 5-6 years ago. The phone rang in my office in Oxford, and it was a BBC News desk. And they said, "This is guy Elon Musk. And he says AI is going to eliminate the world." And we wondered what you had to say about that. And then about 2 weeks later, it was Stephen Hawking, the late, great Stephen Hawking, you know, the world's greatest scientist as was. And Stephen said, this is an existential threat to humanity. AI could be the end of humanity. And in all of that, and you will, I'm sure, anybody who follows the tech news will have seen endless reports along those lines over the past few years. In all of that flurry, I didn't recognise what I was doing. I mean, are they talking about the same thing that I do, was my kind of reaction. And so, as Wendy says, I've written 2 books recently, 2 popular science books on AI. The first was the Ladybird book of AI, so the famous Ladybird series that certainly UK listeners of a certain age will be very familiar with, which was rebooted a couple of years ago. And they rebooted it into a jokey series, and I didn't publish in that. They also rebooted it into the classic series, where they provide short, accessible guides to topics. And so I was absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to do the AI one. And then earlier this year, in fact, just as we went into lockdown, I published a Pelican guide to AI, which is called The Road to Conscious Machines, which is a much longer 400-page exposition of what AI is, what AI researchers actually do, what people think AI is and why the reality of AI is a bit different, the kind of challenges that AI raises and so on. So briefly, let me just say about what is AI. It's a difficult question, and part of the problem is everybody thinks they know something about AI. And why does everybody think they know something about AI? Because you watch movies and you read books and you watch Terminator and you watch 2001: A Space Odyssey or Westworld or whatever, the Ex Machina or She, all of these movies, Blade Runner, all of these movies, which in some sense speak to part of the AI story. So let's call those sort of movies the kind of the Hollywood vision of what AI is. Now, what most people imagine is that what AI researchers do is the Hollywood vision. We're all trying to make, you know, the Ex Machina robots or those things a reality. That's in fact not a big part of the AI story at all. That's called general AI, the dream of building machines which are conscious and self-aware and sentient and autonomous and all have the full range of intellectual capabilities that we have. That's called general AI. The truth is, it's actually a tiny little niche part of AI, and it's by and large not what AI researchers do. What we do is what we focus on is we look at problems that currently require brains, human brains or animal brains, potentially nervous systems as well. Things that computers can't do that at the moment seem to be the preserve of brains. and we try just very specific, narrow little problems, and we try and build machines that can do those narrow, specific problems. So what would examples be? Recognizing faces in a picture would be one example. So you show a picture of a person, and the challenge is to recognize the individual in that picture. Another example, something which 20 years ago we thought was still a long way in the future, automated translation, right? So it's not perfect, right? Google Translate or whatever your personal tool of choice is for translation, they're not perfect, but they will get you around your holiday in Skopelos. They will, in my case, help you to understand how to control the air conditioning in your Beijing hotel room, right? They will function, they will do that sufficiently well. And automated translation, you know, this is one of the great dreams of humanity, right? The Tower of Babel and all of that, which has become a reality over the last 15 years because of advances in narrow AI. Driverless cars are another example. Now, you think actually everything that you think is hard about driverless cars is wrong. All the stuff about whether you should actually slow down or speed up or turn left or turn right and so on, all of that stuff is trivial. We can get computers to do that easily. All of the challenge in driverless cars, which are an imminent possibility and will happen over the next few decades, all of that is about knowing where you are and what's around you. All of the technology in driverless cars at the moment is directed at solving those two problems. And again, it's recent techniques in AI that have solved those. So AI, by and large, just to wrap up, is not about, you know, what AI researchers do and the current advances and all the excitement. It's not really about the Hollywood dream of AI. We could have a debate, and this would really require a glass or two of wine to make it a really good debate. We could have a debate about whether that's really possible, and there is a very active debate about whether it's possible, even whether it's desirable. What AI researchers focus on are getting computers to do things which currently require brains, narrow tasks. That's where all the excitement is. And so why has it happened now? Why are we talking about it at Jersey Tech Week? Because over the last decade, there's been huge progress for three reasons. Number one, there have been some scientific advances, what's called the deep part of the deep learning that we heard about. So there have been some scientific advances, but really relatively modest. The same ideas that have been around for quite a long time in an area that's called neural networks. It's a very fancy name for a very, very simple and very old idea. So number one, some scientific advances, but just as importantly, lots of data and big compute power, which is what you need to be able to build the computer programs that can do these AI challenges. So in summary, AI is real and it is genuinely exciting, but it probably isn't quite what you think it is.
Thank you, Michael, and that's wonderful. Before I hand over, I'm going to go to Jennifer next, but before I will just follow up a little bit. So when I was a young lecturer in computer science, AI was expert systems and rule-based systems, and today it's neural nets and deep learning and all about training on data. Just so to give people and your work was about agent-based AI, you know, intelligent processes talking to each other to come to some collective understanding or collective decision making. What do you think is the next big breakthrough? Where are we going next with AI?
So I'm going to be very lazy and say I think you're exactly right to pick up on the connected AI. I mean, this is my day job in terms of research. The bread and butter of what I've been doing over the last 30 years has been around a following problem. Suppose I got an AI program that's doing stuff for me. So you could imagine that as one of Paul's robots whizzing around a warehouse and so on. Imagine a robot where there are imagine a warehouse, where there are multiple robots owned by different companies, and this is becoming a reality. Walmart are exploring that space right now. Okay, so they're all these robots are built by different companies. They're all AI-powered robots. How are they going to interact with each other? How are they going to have this kind of social skills like cooperation and coordination and negotiation, the kind of social skills that we all have and that we all use every day in our lives? How can we give those skills to computers? That's what my research is. And just as over the last 30 years, we've seen that the reality of computing is not computers that are sat on their own, not talking to one another. The really exciting stuff happens when the computers can talk to one another. I think the really exciting stuff is going to happen when AI programs can talk to one another. So to make that really concrete, right, we've all got a software agent in our pocket on our smartphones, and either it's Siri or Cortana or Alexa, depending on the phone that you carry. So suppose I need a meeting with you, Wendy. why should I phone you, or why should my Siri phone you? Why doesn't my Siri talk directly to your Siri? Why do we have to be in the loop at all? And actually, I don't know if it's the same in your life, but actually, I'm quite sure it is. Actually, a huge part of my life is about managing diaries and scheduling meetings and so on. It's actually quite a big chunk of effort that goes into that. Why haven't we solved that problem? I mean, why can't Siri just talk directly to Siri and get those appointments in there? So to put simply, Siri talking to Siri, Siri talking to Cortana, having those AI programs interact with each other, I think there's really exciting stuff there in the future.
Thank you. And to answer your question, it's because it's very complicated, particularly with our types of diaries. But also, I think your point about Siri talking to Siri opens up all sorts of questions that I think Jennifer might be interested to answer. Now, Jennifer Fischer's from New Jersey, which is, you could say, the new version of Jersey. I don't know. There is, I know, a collaboration between Jersey and New Jersey, and that's, I think, how Jennifer's involved today. She's worked as a tech consultant. She's now an educator and an advisor on AI and ethics. And Jennifer, say a bit more about what you do today and your perspective on AI, and particularly thinking about the ethical issues we're concerned with here.
Sure. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here and be part of the panel today. So although I've been teaching for many, many years, I am new to higher ed in terms of being a full-time part of the institution. I currently am the executive director for the Center for Innovation and Professional Studies at Felician University in New Jersey, in the US. My area of specialization is ethical AI, digital citizenship, and future of work. And that's coming off of 30 plus years in industry. Including Big Four management consulting firm, Fortune 50 companies, more than 10 years in the C-suite. And so my role, it's kind of interesting that it's somewhat similar, although it's a different sector. When I was in the corporate world, I focused a lot on the art of the possible and sort of having the courage and imagination to look beyond what the immediate practical applications were. And I find myself in a very similar position, but only now in higher ed and with a different focus in terms of corporate and government and private-public partnership development to be able to explore this as well. So it's an absolutely wonderful time to be part of the higher ed community. And my experience is a little bit similar to Michael's. I had been in corporate and quite happily moving along in my career, and the phone kept ringing, and I kept getting a lot of questions and requests for, speaking engagements and advisement around AI and ethics. And so that really led me to, which I had been involved in from a research perspective for more than 20 years, but I realized that there seemed to be a new level of awareness in the industry around this. And some of you may have seen, even Google entertaining the thought of providing ethical AI services out to the industry. So it's quite a phenomenon, at least in the U.S., where I think there's a very strong recognition that there needs to be a structural form of governance around the types of decisions that are made with releasing these types of products into the market. And so I agree with Michael. I think my definition of AI is quite similar. From my perspective, it's an ecosystem. If we're talking about, what does that mean from a technology perspective? It's truly an ecosystem. Of course, we can look at things like neural nets and deep learning, et cetera. We can look at aspects of data science and robotics and autonomous systems and Internet of Things. All of those things comprise a different aspect of AI, and I think in terms of the future where we're headed. In terms of how that definition, so if we're talking about machines exhibiting intelligence, whether that's learning from examples and experience, recognizing, understanding, responding to language, making decisions, solving problems, all of those types of things. if we think about what that means in the immediate and the longer term, there's also a recognition that the machines will likely surpass human capabilities in those same respects. So to that end, that's the reason for my interest and passion around ethics in this space, because I think, and whether we're talking about the very beginnings now with narrow, or we're talking about longer term and where it may go, I think we really need to question how we receive such a gift in terms of being able to surpass human capabilities of performance and intelligence. And then the question becomes, what's the responsibility required of us to be successful with such technology? And it's really multi-sector, right? It's across industry, government, military, academia, nonprofits. There's each sector of the economy has the capability to influence and to drive the human aspects of AI, which I think sometimes in terms of just pure commercialization, we get caught in a drive for speed to market and first mover advantage. And of course, we want to be, the first out there with a new technology. But the broader impact to what that means in terms of the users who would be consuming it, it has become more and more at the forefront of folks' minds. So for me, that's why I'm drawn to the ethics piece of it, and that's both in the development and the use.
Thank you, Jennifer. And how many people do you find are people rushing to find out about AI and to sign up to courses? What's the pipeline like, and how do you think sort of your students at your university, do they feel the need to find out about AI? Are they worried about their job prospects? It's really interesting. I think there's both because they're so used to using it in their daily lives. It's a little bit underestimated. I think when we actually start peeling back the layers of the complexity that's involved here, and we're talking about it from whether it's legal and regulatory perspectives, business impact perspectives, longer term societal impacts, those questions hadn't necessarily come to mind. So I'm very fortunate in that although my courses are required for our computer science and cybersecurity majors, I attract pre-law and business and bio majors and just people who are curious about what this technology is going to mean within their future, within their industry, how it's going to impact their jobs, whether they will have a job, how it will be reshaped and what it might look like, how to better work with data. That's certainly on their minds. So, which I think is wonderful because they're thinking ahead and they're being proactive about it. Yes, I don't think that's across the board yet, and it's one of my passions is to get people from a wider background to come into AI. I love that. Yes. Anyway, we could come back to the age thing. We have the problem with the app in the UK, the contact tracing app. The people with old smartphones or no smartphones at all are having a difficulty. They can't use it, and they're probably the people that most need it. So we have these issues across diversity across the board. But I'm going to come to Paul now. Now, Paul, I was very flippant about your awards and honours. I should make it clear that you are a Commander of the British Empire, awarded by the Queen for your services to Queen and country. And he said King and Country then. And also just recently you were awarded you became a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, which is fabulous. So I didn't mean to be flippant about what you're doing, Paul, at all. But I've known you, of course, on the AI Council. That's when we've really got to know each other. And your work with Ocado, which I think of as an AI company. Some people would like to describe it as a food delivery company. So I think I might have said that before. So Paul, please tell us what you think AI is, and also, you know, talk about it from your perspective of a CTO of a big company that is using it a lot to achieve great things at the moment.
Thank you, Wendy. And it's quite intimidating being the only non-professor, you know, on a panel. There we go. But I won't let that stop me. But yes, so my day job is, as Wendy says, is as CTO of Ocado. For those of you who don't know us, we historically were known as an online grocery business, or in fact, the world's largest online-only grocery business, because we don't have any shops. I spent most of my time at Ocado trying to make people understand that actually we're a technology company, because we've always been that. And indeed, if you look a bit further, we've now become a platform business because we sell our capability around the world. But really, take another layer off the onion and you find, you know, we're an innovation factory. We're good at solving hard problems. And one of the, we use a basket of technologies to solve those problems, one of which is AI, another is robotics, another is kind of simulation, the Internet of Things, cloud computing. So we kind of have this alchemical cauldron that we cook with, and we come up with exciting new recipes for how to use those technologies. There are lots and lots of applications of AI across our platforms. You know, things like helping customers shop faster with less, you know, difficulties and friction, as we would call it, greater personalization. Things like fraud detection, forecasting, so predicting what customers are going to buy to make sure that, you know, we have what they want in stock, but at the same time minimize food waste. And
did you get the toilet paper?
I think everybody got hit by the toilet paper.
When we went into lockdown.
Yes. Well, there's a whole story there one could say about what the data tells about the pandemic. But I mean, a really big area in which we use it is about smart machines. It's about building smart machines and controlling them, you know, and optimizing them at scale. And, you know, they range from, you know, swarms of robots that assemble our customers' orders, other kinds of robots that are starting to pick customer orders and pack them, and in the not too distant future, you know, autonomous vehicles delivering customer orders. So, you know, these are all examples of smart machines. You know, one of the challenges when it comes to things like robotics, I was talking about this at an event this morning, is that they are already all around us. You know, we take them for granted, whether they be washing our clothes, washing our dishes, driving us to work, taking us on holiday. These are all smart machines. It's just once we get used to them, we no longer think of them as robots or smart machines. We just think of them as, you know, things that help our lives be, you know, easier and more efficient. I suppose coming back to Michael's definition, my view of smart machine of AI is that it's a basket of technologies, and one of the challenges is it's referred to in the singular, but it isn't really one thing. It's many different tools for solving different kinds of problems, and you take the appropriate tool out to solve the right problem, whether it be recognizing an image or recognizing a piece of text, you know, understanding a piece of text, or you know, optimizing, you know, some part of the behavior of a machine by learning, you know, through doing. You know, these are all kind of different kinds of problems, and there are many of them. So we have to, I think, see it as a kind of a collection of different tools that that we can use. One of the areas, as Wendy knows, that I'm most excited about is something called digital twins. And what is a digital twin? Well, it's massively misunderstood. Lots of people talk about them, but actually they don't mean the same thing to all people. Digital twins start their lives as simulations or mathematical models of something. It could be a machine, it could be a warehouse, it could be an institution like the NHS or national government, or it could be part of our natural environment like our weather system. People have been building simulations of weather for a long time now. And what makes a digital twin out of a simulation is where you connect that mathematical model of something to the physical thing that you're modeling, and you take the data and into the model and you use it to then generate insights and optimizations, and then you feed those back into the physical world, back to the physical twin, if you like, and you create this kind of virtuous circle of data flow and insights and optimizations. And then you've got a true digital twin. And we build them of lots of different parts of our business, and we use them to optimize. I mean, to give you an example, one of my favorite examples is how do we look after swarms of thousands of robots in one warehouse? And we're now building 40 of these around the world at the moment. So that's a lot of, each robot produces 5,000 data points 1,000 times a second. That's a lot of data. And you couldn't get humans staring at a screen trying to optimize that. And so we feed all those data into via the cloud into a digital twin, and we use it to optimize that swarm. But we also use it as a healthcare system. We use it to look after that swarm and to spot when things are starting to become a problem. To be like, it's very akin to kind of preventative medicine with humans, except for our case, the patients are robots rather than humans. But the same principle applies. You're trying to spot the symptoms of an illness, because what you want is to spot a robot that's going to get sick, so you can take it off the field and let one of its friends go on and take over from it. You don't want it to kind of get sick in the midst of doing something. So that's, I think, has direct analogies to what we can do, hopefully, with remote medicine, and indeed,
Right.
digital twins to solve some of our big.
We just had a little loss of sound there, but panel, we've got you all back. So sorry, if you want to rewind about 15 or 20 seconds on what you were saying, we were very absorbed in it, but then lost you. So back to you to pick up.
No, I'm gonna, Paul, I'm gonna ask you another question, which will get you back into that, because I just want to make the point that I'm, as I said to you guys before, that Jersey does have a digital twin project, but Jersey is a small island with 100,000 people on it and has very much autonomy over the data that is on the island. It can manage it in an ethical way, but you have to think about that. But it's a tractable problem in some sense to think about a digital twin of Jersey. Talk us through how we might try and achieve a UK or even an American digital twin, and where we're going to here is national strategies.
So I think we have to start back at data, which is one of your favorite topics, I know, Wendy, and as Michael said, without it, you can't really start doing AI. And so we've got infrastructure that we need to build to be able to harvest and share data in a controlled, secure way, or else, we're not going to get past first base. And that's obviously something that I hope the National Data Strategy recently launched in the UK will be tackling. But data marts, data trusts, data passports, these are all the kind of things we have to kind of build on, and we need it for AI, we need it for smart machines, we need it for digital twins. So I'm going to take that as a given. But the exciting, just exactly the same as what Michael was saying about gluing AIs together, the power of digital twins is when you start connecting them, because you can't model, a whole country with one digital twin. It would be a ridiculously impractical undertaking. What you need to do is crowdsource thousands of digital twins and find a way to glue them together with common kind of smart language and get them talking to one another, so you can build more powerful models and get the kind of network effects of, every time you add one, you can now understand, different parts. So for example, you might start with trying to model, part of an aircraft, and then you model the rest of the aircraft, and then you add, a model of airports and air traffic control and airlines and customer behavior, and now you've got the aviation industry, and then you might start modeling the rest of the transport system, and then you might start modeling the energy system, and you're on the journey then towards building a national digital twin. And that's the kind of the vision that quite a few of us now are mad enough to share. And indeed, Wendy is chairing an organisation called the Centre for Digital Build Britain that is.
Yes, not yet.
Oh, sorry. Oh dear. Oh, apologies. It's involved. is involved in in collaborating with that organisation SMI, and that is all about building this national digital twin. And I think, you know, it is about assembling it. And this is where I think we might get onto an interesting discussion around standards, because, you know, standards used to be a very big thing in the computer industry, and they kind of slightly lost their way. And I think we're going to rediscover them again, because we're going to need lots of standards, not only for, you know, AIs talking to one another, but digital twins and smart machines and lots of other things. And I think what's top of my mind at the moment about why these are so important is because of the properly hard problems that we've created for ourselves at a planetary scale, which I think digital twins and smart machines are going to have to try and get us to solve. And that's where we need, on the back of this pandemic, to think really big about how we do that kind of international collaboration, because quite frankly, I think we'll look back at this pandemic and see it as a bit of a warm-up act for what lies ahead. And so we better learn the lessons quickly, particularly around things like data and the models we build.
And when you think of net zero, I was thinking of your armies of robots, but they require a lot of energy, presumably. I want to just pick up on your point, and I'm going to go back to Jennifer now, because she's sitting in a huge country that has mega cities, right? I don't know whether, we're sitting in the UK, which is a reasonably big island compared to Jersey. It has big cities, one of which is refusing to go into lockdown at the moment. This is it's all about, the argument is about the data. Right, it's really about, well, it's all economic and political as well, I get that, but it's about, or show us the data to prove we need to go into a severe lockdown. And of course the US has had this in big time. You know, how do you decide which states, which cities? So Jennifer, I'm going to pass this to you. This is really a question about you live in one of the AI superpowers, the US. How is the US tackling AI as a strategic issue? And what's your view on, you don't have to comment on digital twins if you don't want to, but what is your view about how a country is like the US can best use AI at a national level?
Well, so I think national strategies are important for a number of reasons. I think in terms of ensuring that your workforce, both your existing as well as your upcoming, have the skills that they need. Ensuring that your economy is competitive. Ensuring that your the provision of services that are affecting your citizens are being thought about and applied in an ethical way. From a humanitarian perspective as well, the social impact and the problem-solving capabilities that AI has the potential to contribute to. When I think about a national strategy, I think that all of those things should culminate in that strategy and be brought to bear. So what I look for, whether we're talking about the U.S. or more broadly, is not only the capabilities themselves from a technology perspective and the infrastructure required to support those capabilities, but also things like equity, privacy, transparency, accountability, economic and social impact, and those are often competing, as you just described, Wendy, right? So if we're thinking about, lockdowns and the data supporting, protection of public health versus, degradation of the economy, both are true. And so it's really a matter of, working through those competing interests and trying to arrive at the appropriate decisions for a given location and what's unique to that location. And to that end, I think, that's perhaps it's a challenge in the sense of, going back to Paul, and I would agree, when we're talking about AI and we're talking about interoperability and the underlying infrastructure that is required to make this work, there is a reliance on standards. And so we do need to recognize that we need to standardize more than we have. Of course, from the US point of view, there's always a reluctance to lock in too tightly to a set of standards, one from an innovation perspective, and two from that sort of localized, specialized type of view that I think is very ingrained in the culture and fabric of our country. So, in terms of the sort of the challenges that we're presented with, I think that's a big one. Where do you standardize, and what are you willing to trade off and compromise in terms of privacy and freedom in general, versus the ability for this technology to thrive and for the data that's required to enable AI to really grow in leaps and bounds to be available.
Thank you. Just before I get back to Michael, maybe a hard question, but be brief. If you, what are the lessons that Jersey can take from this small island, quite a lot of autonomy? Do you want to think about that, or shall I come back? Shall we come back on that one?
Was that question to me?
Oh yeah. Just because you're doing this Jersey, New Jersey. Yeah. What do you? I'm going to go to Michael next. What are the lessons from all this that as Jersey can?
In terms of national strategy?
Yeah, or whatever, however you want to make it. This is the trying to build a digital twin.
Yeah, well, that's an amazing opportunity, a very ambitious undertaking, and to the extent that the autonomy is there, I think it's a very, very valuable endeavor potentially. I think one thing, just in terms of building out a national strategy for Jersey, some of the things that I think have made a difference for other nations has been really taking that multi-stakeholder approach and a co-design approach to building it out, recognizing that there should be uniqueness, right? It should be specific to the populations there. A location with a significantly older population versus younger will have a very, very different perspective on the future of work. And so, how do you really rationalize and engage people in this type of discussion and where they want to see it going? And the other thing I would say is I've seen a lot of national strategies that are sort of a theoretical construct or more of a vision statement, as opposed to including an implementation roadmap. And I think this may be a little bit of an American bias, but one of the things that I always look for is it's great to have the goals set forth, but what's the path, from, it doesn't have to be A to Z, but even if it's, part of the way there, at least let's carve out what we think from a practical perspective needs to be addressed specific to that nation or that location, and also respecting the uniqueness of that nation or location.
Thank you. Now I'm going to turn to Michael for his comments on this section, and then we'll be ready for questions, Gary, okay? So Michael, you're wrapping up this bit. What are your reflections on national strategies, on digital twins? I think agents are very important for digital twins, by the way, and just generally on the skills and jobs landscape.
So I think the first thing to say is I think you did an amazing job there of painting an entrancing picture of a kind of a national digital twin, and I would absolutely buy into that. I think there's a lot that you could do with that, and I think you're absolutely right that the way, if you just start with some grand project that, right, we're going to now build the UK's digital twin, you're not going to get anywhere. I think you need to start locally, but it does mean that you need to think about how those things are connected. And I think that fits very well with Jersey. As you pointed out earlier, Wendy, the Jersey has essentially, as I understand, autonomy over everything apart from its defence strategy, which it shares with the UK, that puts it in a really interesting position. I mean, it's kind of a somewhat parallel to the way that Singapore is positioned, in the sense that Singapore is a small nation state and is able to take advantage of that particularly in terms of sort of data and national policy. And so I think there is an opportunity there, I think, for a Jersey digital twin. And I think thinking about integrating that with healthcare and education and transport, that's where the real value is going to come. I mean, I would love to see such projects. Indeed, we have got some tentative projects along those lines in the UK. I would very, very much love to see them. There are, I mean, I think it would be, you can't have a debate about AI without mentioning the risks, which Jennifer's kind of touched on a little bit. I mean, there are risks associated with having a digital twin, and we need to start thinking about those from the beginning, just to make sure that they're mitigated and that we're doing everything properly. And the big conundrum of AI in 2020 is that to get AI to do things for you, you have to give it your data. But I don't want to give it my data, and finding our way through that, that's one of the defining challenges for AI right now. And the people are taking those issues very, very seriously and thinking about them. So, I mean, that's just a flag up. We will need to think about those. I think just flag up one other area which might be of interest in Jersey in particularly. I mean, if you have, for example, elderly populations, there are big opportunities in using AI to put people in touch with one another, to have telepresence robots, so that people are, not living lives of loneliness, particularly relevant in the pandemic. And again, if done insensitively, that can be a really horrible thing. But it is, we have got the opportunity to change the traditional view of old age, which is that you spend your last years staring through net curtains at the road, in a state of loneliness. And AI has a lot to contribute there, I think, as well as obviously in healthcare and monitoring people's health. Very simple applications of AI right now on my wristwatch. My Apple Watch will monitor for falls. Well, I'm not a high risk category, except after a few glasses of wine, I suppose, but I'm not a high risk category, but there are plenty of people out there who are, and it can make a huge difference. Just even a simple bit of technology which can detect the signs of a fall and potentially call emergency services on your behalf. So there's a lot. I think those are the two things. I say, Paul, I think you did a great job in setting up that vision for a digital twin, and I think Jersey's well positioned to be able to do that. But I would also think about, and I say, using that to empower healthcare, transport, education, and so on, I think is very exciting. But then secondarily, I think, in healthcare in particular, I think there are some obvious applications there.
Paul, do you want to come back, Paul?
Just very, very quickly on the Jersey point, because just to build on what the others have just said, I often talk about the UK has an opportunity to create a country scale living lab, and obviously Singapore has kind of done that, and I think Jersey has an amazing opportunity to do that as an island, in terms of all sorts of smart services, whether it be autonomous vehicles or drones or whatever it is. But use it to learn to experiment on what works, because you can do it at a smaller scale, which makes it more manageable. And then I think the other one, Wendy knows I'm passionate about education. Think about what the long-term implications of AI are going to be, not only on work, but on the way that we educate and the implications, for what we teach and how we teach, because, the smart, more automated world we're going to build together has big implications for that. So you've got a chance to tune your education system in a way that's harder to do at a national level.
I can assure you that is music to Digital Jersey's ears. That's what they have in their strategy. So, Gary, do you have one or two questions for us?
Do you know what, Wendy? I wish we had more than 7 minutes, because I have about 100 questions for you. It has been utterly fascinating from all four of you. Wendy, I'll leave you to decide who gets this question. With increasing scrutiny on big tech, what kind of regulation do you think is needed to protect people from having their behaviours manipulated by algorithms on social media? Feels like a real question of our time.
It is. Who wants to go first? I don't mind. Have a go at that one.
I can go first. I mean, I think so. I should first to say I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I enjoy using both of those products. Well aware of the issues surrounding them, but my sense is that we are reaching a point where I think that we're heading for a kind of a breakup of some kind in terms of to breaking up digital monopolies, and I think if social media organizations can't get their act together comprehensively to stem dangerous misinformation, which sadly is the pandemic has kind of seems to have cultured. I think then there's a much stricter regulatory environment heading their way is my guess. So yes, I think there's a lot of work to do there. It's worth saying, by the way, I mean, a standard answer is, can't we use AI to detect fake news and so on? With some quite subtle reasons, it's actually not that easy to do. One thing I am worried about actually is, sorry if I'm just dragging out the question, but AI is getting better and better at generating fake news. With just little seeds of stories, you can generate what appear to be quite complex, plausible narratives that take quite some time and effort for us, for human beings, to get to the bottom of and realize that they actually are fake. And I really worry about, in a few years' time, whether we're going to be existing in a world where there's far, far, far more fake news than there actually is real news. If that happens, then I think that's going to be that may be the death knell for social media as we know it. It's hard to see how Twitter could exist, for example, in anything like its current form if there are just, if there are 10,000 fake news stories for every true story, and it just won't be that hard to do in a couple of years.
I'm going to go to Jennifer. What's it feel like in the US, the whole issue of regulation in this space?
Oh, this is definitely a sore spot, and we struggle, I think, with what the original intent of having internet speech and the ability to essentially self-regulate, and that's shown to be, and I think Michael hit on it as well. It may be a very unrealistic expectation given the proliferation and the capabilities around deep fakes and fake news and all of that. My personal view, I would much rather see the effort and investment be spent on helping individuals to be more moral in their actions than trying to police and censor the speech of particular individuals and having some sort of fact-checking police that is inherently biased in one way or another. It can't work. It won't work. If we're talking about a standard, a regulatory standard that every social media company has to comply with, that's sort of one thing, and I think that may be the way to go. I think the situation as it is, though, is not it's not tenable as it stands now.
I'm with you on that, Jennifer. Now, Paul, last word on this one.
I suppose I'm interested. I and others are interested in tackling this from the other end of the telescope, which is about saying, if you don't want to end up where we are, what do you have to do to make sure that you have the building blocks in common ownership? And I think, Wendy, you talk very eloquently about the origins of the World Wide Web, and I think part of what we need to build around some of these data and this kind of the commons for gluing together digital twins, all that sort of stuff, is like the World Wide Web, the kind of owned by nobody, used by everybody type model. And I think how you build these kind of common pieces of data of digital infrastructure and put them into public ownership, whether it be with an open source model or whatever, to try and make sure that there is greater choice and that you're not necessarily locked into what comes out of the big technology companies. And I think that's that's just another piece of this puzzle that we've got to assemble.
Yeah, it's really hard stuff, this. Gary, have we time for one more, please?
Do you know what? Because you asked so nicely, we have time for one more. I urge you all to be as pithy as possible, but as fascinating as ever. A question here. Data can contain unconscious bias in its collection methods. How do you try to identify and eliminate them so we don't perpetuate confirmation bias?
God, that's a very detailed question for a last question. People might want to take it up a level a bit, but Mike, I can see you ready to answer it.
Well, that question puts its finger on one of the huge challenges that's facing the AI community at the moment. You're absolutely right. It's a huge problem, and we're only really just beginning to understand, although I suspect Wendy will tell us, and possibly Jennifer as well, that actually people have been saying this for decades, that actually the world's data sets, the data sets that are used routinely by machine learning labs across the world, are hopelessly biased. I mean, they represent a very small cross-section of society, and you can guess exactly which cross-section of society that is. And we need a fundamental rethink. I think the good news is that these issues are recognised. It will take us time to get them right, but they are recognised right now, and there's a huge amount of work going on within the community. But every week, my prediction is every week for the foreseeable future, there will be another hugely embarrassing story of how an AI system is just hopelessly biased and making embarrassingly obvious biased decisions in the way that it works. But you're absolutely right, huge issue right now.
So, Paul, I'm going to come to you next. How do you seek to keep bias out of your systems? Because I can see all sorts of ways that you could persuade a nation how to eat if you wanted to, for good or bad. How do you seek to keep bias out of your systems?
Well, I think you have to keep. I mean, it's similar to the same techniques that we use to build good software. You know, in terms of how you assemble these models from component parts, how you have kind of what one would call regression testing, how you test them and retest them regularly to try and make sure that they haven't kind of headed off in the wrong direction. And I think, you know, you every time you find something that they are susceptible to, you add it to the kind of the test set to try and make sure that the next version that you build, you know, doesn't catch you out of that. And it's a steady process of just trying to come up with better and better tests. But of course, you know, Wendy, to come back to a topic that you are very passionate about, it is all around, you know, the diversity of the people also who are building them in the first place and contributing to those data sets that Michael was talking about. So I think, you know, we've got to do lots of different things to tackle this problem. I don't think there's any one particular solution.
So last word to you, Jennifer, on this panel.
Yeah, no, I would agree with everything that's been said. It's a matter of people, process, and technology, of bringing ethical risk management into the life cycle in terms of development, looking at different techniques, whether that be things like participatory design, inclusive design, you know, broadened testing to account for unintended consequences, even, you know, certain tooling to be able to sort of audit your own data sets and be able to detect certain types of patterns that you may not have intended to be there. So it's really, for me, it's more about checks and balances and making sure that there is that, because bias is part of your AI design, and so bias will always be there in terms of data. The question really is, what are the ethical harms that are involved, and can those be mitigated?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just to remind everyone, we are all biased just because we're different, right? We're just
right. And that's a good thing.
Yes, exactly. And it's how you make sure that the system we're building is can rise above that, if you like,
exactly.
And treat everybody fairly. Gary, well, I just, before I hand back to Gary, I just want to say a huge thank you. You've been a dream panel as far as I'm concerned. Absolute dream. You've been wonderful. full diverse ideas, and you all come from different backgrounds, and thank you so much for giving us your time this afternoon, giving Jersey your time this afternoon. And Gary, back to you.
Wendy, thank you so much. I am equally biased in my praise to all four of you. It's been an absolute thrill, and I've learned an awful lot, learning about the ethics of AI, issues of privacy, even social interactions between competing robots in the same factory from different companies. Who knew we'd be learning that today?
I think we're going to move 100% digital.
Flowers are blooming in the Internet of Things world. And I think now is the time for entrepreneurs to be jumping into this space and creating the products and services around IoT.
Long term, there'll be many more jobs because of AI, and it's going to change our world unimaginably.
I think everything we do will need to be automated. That doesn't mean we're going to have fewer jobs. It means we're going to have more interesting jobs.
The thing about today's artificial intelligence has been around for 50, 60 years, but the wave we're in at the moment is machine learning, deep learning, which works on training on data. It's all about the fact we've got lots of data and very fast machines to process that data.
So today, very much looking at AI. Just to give you a little look ahead as to what's happening tomorrow, we're going to begin our morning looking at digital health. It's an area that absolutely fascinates me personally for many reasons, and how we're augmenting reality to work as far as surgeons and medics delivering their healthcare goes, but also from a patient's perspective, how it's transforming things as well. So we'll be doing that with our session looking at digital health, and that's all happening tomorrow morning between 9 and 11. And then tomorrow afternoon, we're looking at Jersey as an island test bed. Wherever you are tuned in around the world right now, if you are looking for somewhere to trial that product or service, could I recommend Jersey to you? Well, that's something we'll be looking at as well tomorrow afternoon between 3 and 5. So if you want to sign up for those sessions, just get yourself to digital.je/TechWeek. You will find all the details there. And indeed, if you've missed any of the sessions that we've done so far this week, they're available to watch back online as well. There is so much right here at Jersey Tech Week.
We are producing exponential amounts of data every day. Even as we're sitting here, we're producing about 2 megs of ambient data every second, each one of us. But we actually analyze less than 1% of it, and we share even less of it.
AI will help us manage our world better. Jersey should just become a startup for the world, basically, for AI experiments.
So lots more to come, lots more to learn. If you are heading on social media, please do use the hashtag Jersey Tech Week. We're using that in abundance, particularly I noticed on LinkedIn today. We get some really good debates happening online on social media after our actual debates here in the hub, and joining our guests around the world as well. So please do that. Check out lots on LinkedIn. And I would say this, but please give Digital Jersey a follow. Likewise on Twitter and Facebook as well. And indeed, if you've got any questions, as much as we are punting for these questions during the course of our panels, please add them into the comments to any of the posts, because we are checking them all out. And even if we don't get across them in terms of our panels here during Jersey Tech Week, it will help inform the sorts of things we'll be talking about in future weeks, whether it comes to sessions in the Digital Jersey Hub, or indeed the many blog posts you'll find at digital.je as well. A very good afternoon to you. My name is Gary Burgess. This is Jersey Tech Week. We are on to day 2 of 5. Lots to come right across the week. A little bit later in the week, we'll be looking at Jersey as a smart island. I was privileged enough really to scratch beneath the surface of Jersey to find out a little bit about it, what is going on literally beneath my feet. I took a cycle ride. I found out I was on a smart cycle path. I stopped at a road junction. It was a smart traffic light, air sensors all around. I don't want to spoil everything by telling it you all, but I promise that is session certainly worth looking out for later this week. And then on Friday afternoon, we culminate with the Jersey Tech Awards. Each year, a highlight of our digital year, because there is so much good work going on in the islands, and an opportunity to recognise that. It is the cliche to say it is the Oscars of the digital world, but you know what? Cliches are cliches because we use them a lot, and that's what I'm declaring them. For now, though, it's on to another panel session. We've spoken a lot about the theory of AI, and we're going to talk about its practical application. Tom Hacquoil is here. Afternoon to you. Natty Knitwear as well. Your panel is all set. Take it away. Looking forward to this.
Thanks, Gary. Hi, everyone. So I'm Tom from Pinpoint, and we've got a great panel today. I think it was really good and enjoyable to listen to the panel before us talk about kind of AI from an ethics, from a moral perspective, and at sort of that macro level. I think what we intend to do with the time we've got with you today is dig a bit deeper and talk about the sort of more practical ramifications of AI and how it translates into the work you do day to day in your organizations. I think I'm joined by a bunch of great folks, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves if they can. So I've got Simeon Moss here with me today.
Thanks, Tom. So Simeon Moss, I lead Deloitte's consulting and digital transformation practice here in the Channel Islands. Great to be here in terms of a sort of good example of hybrid working. So myself and Tom perched on either side of our virtual guests. So very looking forward to the debate and talking through some of the practical applications of AI.
We've also got Mo Marikar.
Hi, I'm Mohammed Marikar, the Director of Intelligence and Automation at RBC. I lead AI efforts for sales enablement for RBC's global wealth management business. Of course, a lot of work for the team up in Jersey, as well as for the Canadian and US businesses.
Thanks, Mo. And we're also joined by Ryhs Davies.
Good afternoon, everybody. My pleasure to join virtually what I think must be my first hybrid panel. So this is fantastic to be a part of. So my name is Harry. I focus on supporting AI companies at TechNation, which is a government-backed body that supports the UK tech sector. And we're really all about taking practical use cases of AI led by entrepreneurs and really helping those entrepreneurs reach a level of scale and hopefully one day reach the lofty heights of Darktrace or DeepMind or Benevolent AI. We can talk a little bit about that later on.
Great, thanks, Harry. So I think the agenda for the session today is obviously we've had introductions from the panel. We're going to dig straight in and talk about kind of how AI translates to your business and why you might want to take advantage of it. We're going to hear some stories and some kind of best practices in how you might take that approach and things to be aware of as you start that journey toward sort of adopting AI within your organizations. We're going to hear some war stories from all three chaps. And then hopefully we can have a bit of a freewheeling debate and take audience questions. I think I'm going to rudely check my phone very frequently because it's where I see your questions, and I'd love to see those come through. So introduce yourselves in the chat, give us a sense of who you are, where you work, and please fire questions away throughout. Like, we want to make sure the session is as interactive as possible because we're here to kind of give relevant content to you. So I think to kick us off with a bit about sort of why there is, you know, where AI forms part of your strategy, sort of demystifying some of the concerns people often have, I'm going to hand straight over to Simeon and fire away.
Great, thanks, Tom. Well, I think I'd start off with just to say that the sort of power of automation and AI really is the sort of power to sort of reimagine the way that we do things. And I think it's sort of quite a sort of complex sort of topic in relation to all of the underlying technologies, the sort of plethora of sort of innovations that we're sort of faced with at the moment. And I think there's a lot sort of under the banner of artificial intelligence or cognitive solutions. And when you couple that with digitization, with cloud, with data, it's quite a daunting sort of prospect when you try and weave that into your business strategy in terms of where do you start. And I think in terms of demystifying the whole topic, I'd probably sort of highlight personally three things that I would always consider. And I think one, AI mimics human task automation and processes. And I think it does a great job at matching and recognizing patterns in data. But in itself, it's not self-aware. So I think there was a great sort of talk at the last session around the sort of Hollywood effect of AI which is very much around sort of fear and the sort of growth of robots and sort of taking over the world. But I think from a business sense and the here and now, I think there are sort of more practical examples to consider. So I would sort of suggest it sort of supports and enhances humans, augments what people can do, and it's a human endeavour and not something that either threatens or sort of replaces the human in the workplace. And as such, I think we have the sort of concept of humans with technology, humans with augmentation. And finally, I think it's the third point, I'd say strategic decisions really are no longer made in isolation, and there is sort of some layer of technology discussion applied to the strategic agenda nowadays. Sort of a recent sort of survey that Deloitte did, which was sort of the state of AI in the enterprise. We garnered responses from over 2,700 executives with a sort of 50-50 split between technologists and also business leaders. The interesting thing about this research is that we had a couple of dimensions where we asked about the benefits of AI. One was actually around benefits that had been achieved in a material way, and then set against how objectives were then positioned in the organisation as being a sort of significant reported objective. And rather than the sort of normal sort of theoretical benefits of AI, which you'll often hear, this actually brought those benefits very much into the foreground. So the top responses were really around sort of processes becoming more efficient, the ability to make better decision making, to redefine processes, both internally and for customers, and also enhancing relationships with external customers. And all of these were very significant realized benefits that organizations had experienced. Interestingly, very low down on the list was actually just the simple objective of cost cutting. So we're certainly seeing capacity release, doing more with the same, a sort of common theme coming out of our research on AI recently. And I think just to conclude a sort of summary of this piece of research, when asked about whether AI would transform either an individual's organization or their industry with a sort of time span of the next 1 to 3 years, 46% responded that it would have a significant impact within their own organization, and 36% across the industry. So actually we can sort of conclude from that for early adopters, there does seem to be sort of significant competitive advantage that can be sort of gained through implementing these technologies.
Awesome, thanks, Simeon. I think it's really interesting to hear. It's great that we've got some actual quantifiable data to kind of bring to the table and support this discussion. But I think second to that, it's great to hear that cost cutting isn't the sort of primary objective here. I think you talk about the Hollywood effect, and we heard a lot in the previous debate about sort of the merits and underlying motivations of leveraging AI. And I think it's interesting and sort of perhaps controversial to hear that cost cutting and headcount reduction isn't one of those things. I think capacity release is a goal we can all shoot for here, and great to see that high on the agenda for people. So I think thanks for setting the scene for us there and sort of outlining why we might want to adopt AI across our business. I think, Mo, can you talk a little about how you've seen that within your own organization and sort of some of the streams of work you've leveraged and some best practice people can take away from that experience?
Sure. So the key to starting off with AI really is to start small. I think the journey that a lot of organizations take it's sort of one of two things. You either try to go after something really big and you either strike lucky and do well, or you start off with something small, which then allows you to experiment with the technology, learn from the technology, and figure out where it really works. Right? So for us, we've made plenty of mistakes as well in the last few years. But we've done both. So and it's quite illustrative for us. We tried to replicate the large human analysis process, and sort of replicate what would be a large part of someone's role. This was a long-term R&D project, took several years together with R&D partners, universities, and internally. It resulted in lots of small improvements, but the actual ultimate goal was never achieved. On the other hand, we tried out some really small applications to help with our due diligence process using natural language understanding technology, looking at pattern spotting technology, data aggregation technology, and found that we were able to make really quick turnarounds and make a very quick impact on the organization in very short space of time. I think what's important to us here is that, as technologists ourselves, we are often bought into a lot of the hype. Hey, this business problem that was otherwise a 1 year long change process with something with a shortcut with some new AI technology. That's never really the case, right? AI is ultimately at its heart software, which does a little bit more for some human decision making that we might have not expected in software before, but it is still within the concepts of organizations like ours in software. So the key thing that I bear in mind: start small. Any AI system is only as smart as the data that goes into it. So bear in mind what the key difference here is that you're learning from data rather than following a process that's been coded in, right? In most cases. So selecting your data is important. Making sure that data is good quality is important. Actually resourcing your organization to care about data is important. And also doing some of it yourself. So, I'm sure you'll be hearing from plenty of vendors that will be able to help you with lots of different AI solutions. But I think it's important to trust your internal technology team, even if they don't know the new tech, they know your internal data. So trying something out, even if it failed internally, and especially if it failed internally, will give you that institutional knowledge, so you're a lot smarter with vendors. You know where it's worth spending money, where it's not worth spending money. As opposed to kind of being sort of led, which can happen.
Cool, thank you for that, Mo. I think, Harry, can you give us some examples of where you've seen this work particularly well and sort of some best practice you've seen with all the organizations you work with at TechNation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think my focus very much is on startups using AI at the core of their product, and a lot of this is very supplier driven as well. And I think the good news for us ultimately is that really the UK is by far ahead when it comes to AI investments in the UK. So about $1.48 billion so far in 2020 we put into AI startups across the UK. That's about 3 times ahead of the next country, France. Just over $500 billion. So really the UK is going from strength to strength with respect to AI investment, companies using AI in a variety of places to make the world of businesses a better place. We see really a plethora of different use cases. There's a great report by MMC that was released last year that showed about 21% or so of AI companies are solving use cases in healthcare. And we certainly see a lot of this. So we have a number of companies that are using computer vision to look at how can you diagnose an element of cancer more effectively, and more efficiently, and more reliably. How might you, for example, use artificial intelligence to come up with new combinations of treatments or drugs or therapy for conditions like Alzheimer's? Even all the way extending to really cutting edge companies like BIOS and Cambridge, who really look at using a blend of artificial intelligence and really understanding the human nervous system to look at how you better diagnose and treat certain conditions like Parkinson's. So healthcare is certainly something we see a lot of. Next, I think finance is a really big one that we tend to see. There's a great company called Tractable, which is doing very well in the UK, not just in the UK, but globally. And they very much look at the challenge of damage appraisal of cars. So rather than having somebody physically have to check a car after it's been damaged, which takes about 30 days to do for insurers, they can use artificial intelligence and computer vision to get that down to about a week. And that's $1 trillion market across the world ultimately. So you can just imagine the savings and the efficiency gain from just that particular use case alone. And then finally, we're seeing use cases now in really innovative areas. So, for example, artificial intelligence that moves us towards our net zero target in the UK. We have companies like Grey Parrot or Recycleye that are very much using AI to look at how can you tell the difference between very subtly different types of plastic when you're recycling, and how do you automate that such that you can drastically increase the amount we recycle as a country in waste management centres. So no longer do you have to have this sort of really ambiguous sort of pick and mix of what you can and can't recycle. It's all automated and all made more impactful. And that massively increases the amount that we recycle and reduces the amount that goes through to landfill. So we're really seeing some very innovative cases, really across healthcare, finance, mobility and autonomous vehicles, of course, but then also wider use cases around, combating disinformation online, moving us towards net zero, and plenty of other things as well too.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. I think there's lots more to discuss. It's great that we're already getting a whole kind of barrage of questions coming through, and please keep those coming because it really helps us shape this discussion to add as much value as possible for you. I think we're going to dive right into a few of them and then we can circle back to our original agenda. And I'd like to start by just sort of paraphrasing a few things. So what I'm seeing coming through in the questions is lots of conversation and lots of talk about fear, right? And lots of the sort of general theme is I'm unsure where to start. What are the concerns? We've had a question about Stephen Hawking talking about the world being overtaken by general intelligence, AI, and things like that. And I think what's really interesting is the perspective around AI is quite polarizing, and we sort of heard that being talked to in the previous debate, which was fantastic. I think love to hear the thoughts from the panel around sort of how businesses can start changing that mindset. I think if any organization, big or small, is to embrace AI, they're going to have to start by changing the mindset of their team, getting them excited about an AI project and ensuring that it resonates with that audience and that they're engaging and sort of all singing from that same hymn sheet. So perhaps to start us off, Simeon, any thoughts on how businesses can change?
Yeah, and I think that mindset shift is quite an important one because it is talking about the organization transforming, but transforming in sort of incremental steps, but using sort of common technologies, whether that's through machine learning, through robotic process automation, etc. And I think really organizations need to understand their motivation for change to start with, and really sort of promote and pursue a creative mindset, not only within the boardroom and with leadership, but actually throughout the organization. And I think we've seen a number of instances where with work we've been doing with clients, actually we've embedded sort of cognitive cloud-based tools into the organization, which then look to sort of extract the sort of innovative ideas from all of the employees. That tool set then sort of collates that, deduplicates it, and actually starts to look at the sort of the natural patterns coming out. And I think that then actually generates new areas of opportunity, but also then starts to influence the broader culture around that innovative mindset. And I think actually looking at the sort of now to the future, I think there's been lots of disruption in the past. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, people sort of being fearful of sort of large scale mills and moving away from cottage industries. It's no different today. And I think really one of the key things is actually that change is inevitable. But organizations do need to be cognizant about actually how do they manage the transition, because today's teams are not necessarily tomorrow's teams, both in terms of skill set or the types of things that we would be asking them to do.
Amazing. We've got kind of two quite different perspectives, fortunately, in Harry and Mo. So obviously Harry working with startups right at the sort of formative stages of their life cycle, and then Mo working in an absolute monster of an organization that does wonderful things. I think maybe we'll start with you, Mo. Like, how have you seen that process, and how have you seen that sort of mindset change and the embracing of that within the organization in which you work?
It's been a journey, which I think is the polite way of saying it's been a bit slow. But it's really kind of melding the two cultures. So I think, in any large corporation, you're used to sort of long change projects, and often change projects, there are reasons for them being long, because you need to change HR processes, you need to change policies, you need to change, people's roles in order to accommodate the changes, when you introduce a new system. For us, a lot of the last sort of 3-4 years has been learning from the startup environment. We've now established our own ventures arm in Canada, where we kind of take people both from within RBC, but also from the external kind of career market, and let them work on individual problems, start up separate companies, which are of course then financed by RBC. And I think there's a lot to learn from that sort of environment. Because what we often find within corporations is that you have an idea, and then rather than kind of given space to pursue that idea, you have to get a bunch of approvals, and then 6 months later, the market opportunity is gone and someone else has done it, right? And what we need to inculcate is that sort of culture of seeing an idea, taking some action, having ownership rather, at an individual level, rather than having all the ownership at senior levels. And we are getting there now. So, in the early days, it used to be innovations teams that had a little bit of this extra ownership and were able to go after this. Over time, we're sort of trying to kind of introduce a change in the organization so that people, when they see problems, they can take action. And if they need help, they can ask for that help and get that help rather than being told, hey, so that's all. But yeah, it's a journey and you need to bring your executives with you. Pressure from the board does help.
I think that's super interesting. I think, Harry, what's your perspective on this? I guess, like, is the challenge, given you're working with startups for which AI is kind of the core of the proposition, like, is the challenge not with the users and the teams that you're working with, but with their sort of the recipients and the consumers of their services? Where do you see these challenges?
Yeah, you're right. I think a lot of the challenge is ultimately really, I suppose, taking customers through the journey of buying an AI product, which is quite different actually from a typical software business. And to buy an AI company, typically you need data prepared, you need, as Simeon rightly said earlier, the right mindsets. And it's not always particularly clear. So when you have a black box often with an AI product, it's not as if you can clearly see end to end the decision making that goes on underneath the hood, so to speak. But to the extent to which you can control it, I mean, you have inputs, you have outputs, and you can define processes and end to end systems that keep a human in the loop, or at least make sure that you've got control of your decision making in a way that mitigates some of the fear that we mentioned earlier. And I think that the real, I suppose, cut through with selling an AI product is really selling the benefit here and the upside of what these companies are doing, which is typically saving time, saving money, making something far more efficient, or something much cheaper, or being able to solve a task that you couldn't necessarily do before, so driverless vehicles or whatever that might be. Or you give people back time. So a company that's diagnosing a certain condition, for example, might not replace doctors, I think, as a lot of people might fear, but would at least give them back time to do things that potentially are more value adding in their day, and allows them to triage better, as an example. So I think there's certainly considerations, but I think there are certainly ways of mitigating it as well too.
Cool, makes perfect sense. I think what we'll try and do is sort of yin and yang between kind of very practical takeaway questions and some of the sort of more macro and strategic stuff. And I think if we dig into the sort of practical stuff to get started, I think, like, let's plot a bit of a scenario. So I'm a sort of mid-sized, let's say, financial services business. I've got 200 people. I'm not really deploying AI at all in my organization right now. Where do I start? Like, how do I evaluate what the most sensible kind of tiptoe into the space of AI is? How do I understand where to deploy that? Do I work with a third-party vendor? Do I leverage internal development? Sort of what are those first forays into AI, and how should I be thinking about that as the leader of an organization? Happy to start with you again, Simeon.
Yeah, I think organizations should look at not only their own industry, but I think to broader industry for success stories. I think there's benefit in looking at what others have done well, and I think just given the sort of number of technologies that needs to be deployed, I think some sort of support is typically needed in these cases, and whether that's from sort of big organizations such as Deloitte, or sort of working with regtechs, fintechs, and it's probably a combination, and actually building out that sort of ecosystem, so that you can start to support organizations as they sort of move through this journey. I think most organizations will also know their pain points. I think local industry.
Yep.
I think we take sort of KYC, CDD. It's sort of a sort of very topical conversation.
Sure.
One that's sort of very prevalent on the island. But then you sort of then expand that out into sort of regulatory compliance, and then move into sort of some of the sort of more transactional areas that organisations get involved in. Just something as simple as payments, and actually how you move away from manual-based, paper-based systems into something where you are adopting machine learning, you're reading data, those systems are sort of intelligently then pushing that through digital workflow, and then automating the process, but still having humans in the loop to sort of deal with errors and where necessary to sort of sign off and make approvals. So I think that's just sort of practical areas where organizations can start. And then also, I think just to sort of consider maybe it's sort of an enabler to just unlock the power of data. Lots of organisations sort of custodians of vast amounts of data, and actually, if they can harness those in the cloud, actually manage to sort of aggregate, apply analytics and visualization onto those, they can often unlock a lot of new benefits, potential new services for underlying customers and clients.
I think just to shift to Mo and just to build on that a little bit, two questions for you, Mo. So one, you talked a few minutes ago about sort of looking outward. Well, so Simeon's just talked about how we should look outwardly and understand not just what people in our industry or our kind of brother and sister companies are doing, but looking at other industries, different shapes and sizes of organizations to really try and learn from best practice, which I think makes perfect sense. I think you talked a few minutes ago about how you obviously have been learning from startups and startup culture and sort of trying to take a leaf out of that book, and that makes a lot of sense. I'd love to learn more, about how you found that transition, because I think I've spoken to lots of businesses that certainly wouldn't be considered startups, and they sort of look at startups through a slightly different lens and might struggle to understand how they can translate some of those learnings. And then the second thing I'd say is, when we spoke earlier, you talked about sort of natural language processing and some of the work you've been doing, and to pick up on Simeon's point there around specific workflows and payment processes in his example, sort of how have you seen that practically deployed within your organization, and sort of what have been the outcome of that?
Sure. So when it comes to kind of thinking about this sort of startup culture, a large corporation is never going to completely embrace that, and it's not necessarily even possible. So if you look at the likes of large digital companies like Google, they have departed quite a lot from the initial startup culture that they had because of their size, and it just becomes difficult to manage, right? What you can do, however, is inculcate parts of that culture within the team. So if you think, so a company like ours, I guess this is true for a lot of the financial companies in Jersey, the people that know your business the best, your relationship managers, your trust administrators, what you really want to do is to enable them to drive the technology advancement, right? And the way you do that is, you can't put everyone on a coding course, but what you can do is embed your technical team with the people who are doing the actual work, as opposed to, and this is where, I guess this is a key learning from the startup environment, that, a startup doesn't have like an IT department that you speak to like on a call once a week, right? They're literally right there with the business people, with whoever's running the relationships together as a single unit, and everyone is aware of what's going on, and they chip into each other's work. So if there's, they're overwhelmed with customer queries, hey, the IT person's also picking up the phone and dealing with it, right? Now, the advantage you get by replicating even part of that culture is that once you have an IT person embedded, for example, in the sales team, in the trust administration team, they learn all the things that you don't get from user interviews, that you don't get from all the business analysis, fact-finding type sessions. And then the sort of solutions that bubble out of that are much more impactful as a result. Right? The other thing to bear in mind is that you can start change really, really cheaply. Right? So, if we go back even 10 years ago, if we were to do anything kind of serious with AI technology, whether it be natural language processing or even something a lot simpler, you were looking typically at least a six-figure sum to start a project off the ground. Now you can start, you can complete a project and do something like really impactful for in the very low 5 figures. Right? It's much more reachable, it's much more of a reachable goal. Going back to kind of an earlier question that you posed, when it comes to kind of selecting things to work on, what you really want to look at, you don't want to kind of be too deliberate about it, and you don't fall into that sort of corporate culture of, hey, we're going to look at the organization and decide what's going to be worked on. Again, what you want to be able to do is decide on a sum of money that you're willing to experiment with, and then throw it out to your staff and say, look, this money is going to be available. I want you to come to us with ideas. And yes, you're going to have some duplication, but that's fine because the costs are gone down so much that a little bit of duplication actually doesn't matter and it will work itself out. Going to your second question, so natural language processing has been really interesting to us, and it's a good example of sort of like the power of AI. So if you think about, if you can closely define a process and you can write a detailed process document, then typically speaking, you don't need AI. What you're looking at is automation. Someone should look at that process document and write a program. When you're looking at a process where there is some thought involved, like you're doing a sense check or you're making a judgment call about whether a piece of information is important or not, that's where you need to think about AI. And this kind of depends on how much thinking is involved. So right now, I would say that AI is probably capable of probably about 3 or 4 seconds of thinking. Something that you're racking your brains about for an hour or two is probably not suitable for AI. And what I mean here is things like research. So in the private client world, particularly in Jersey, lots of our clients are international. Their assets are in lots of different countries. A key part of preparation work is looking at what people own, what businesses they're involved in, and aggregating that information together. A lot of this simply starts with a Google search, right? You're looking at, well, hey, is something important? Will that be relevant to how I deal with the client? Will it be relevant to their risk situation? Now, you might be able to write a process for a bit of this, but really it's a judgment call. You're reading an article, you're reading a piece of news, you're reading about an M&A transaction, you're reading an interview with someone, and you're figuring out whether a piece of information is important or not. And this is where natural language processing actually helps you kind of model those sort of decisions, where you can say, okay, look for things related to, say, hobbies or interests, or look for company purchases. So if you see certain types of language that says that one company bought another, extract those relationships and tell me who the buyer and who the seller is. These are the sort of things where, traditionally it's very manual sort of research effort, very time heavy. These are the sort of things which are actually really simple to automate now with AI. A lot of cloud AI solutions are available, so you don't actually need to build a lot of these things yourself. Natural language processing is probably one of the cheapest things that you can deploy. So, realistically speaking, you can embed a programmer in the relationship management or administration team and have something turned around less than 10,000 times, and it will work.
Cool, thank you, Mo. I think, Harry, just to slightly change the question to put it into context for some of the great work you're doing, I think Mo talked a bit there about the impact of the sort of broader environment and the cost base, and that sort of barrier to entry being significantly lowered by reduction in cost of infrastructure, sort of platforms as a service and things like that. I guess I'm interested in understanding from you two things really. So one, how have you seen that kind of impact the startup environment around AI firsthand? And two, given the sort of influx of AI startups and businesses in the space, sort of for a more traditional organization, let's just say, that isn't kind of at the cutting edge and wouldn't typically be considered an early adopter, like where did they go to learn about these organizations? I'm sure there's organizations out there building tools that are super relevant to these businesses, and they might be considering rolling their own where there's an off-the-shelf solution that has people with real domain experience. Where can people go to find out more about these organizations, and sort of how should they be thinking about adopting them within their business?
Yeah, so tackling the latter first, I would say, I would advise buying a solution to solve the problem that you want to solve, and not the technology per se. I think the danger in this conversation is that you can always end up in a situation where you want to buy an AI product for the sake of buying an AI product, and it's not always necessarily the best solution. It's back to that old adage of, everything, you've really got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think sometimes, Occam's razor applies here, where simpler solutions are often the best, and often something quite easy to plug in, something simple, something cheap, something out of the box might work for you and might get you 80% of the way there. And you might not necessarily need a proprietary deep learning or reinforcement-driven platform to get to where you need to be. So I think firstly, really think about what is it you want to do, what is it you want to solve, and start there and work backwards. And you might find that an AI product fits well within that, but not always. And typically the suppliers that you'll be working with in this situation might not even necessarily make clear that they're using AI as part of the product, right? So, a lot of these startups and suppliers will be selling you the solution of what they do and the practical output of what they do, but it might not necessarily be so clear at the first instance that they're using AI under the hood. So I would say, don't be too overwhelmed by the need to think that you should be using AI because everybody else is doing it. Just think about, how do I solve the problem that I want to solve as an individual? And you'll find these sorts of companies in your trades. You'll find them on the supplier websites. You'll find them on the venture capital portfolio websites. Most likely, if they're solving a problem in your space, you'll very likely come across them. Some of which will be using AI, some of whom won't. And I've forgotten your first question there, Tom, but I hope that's answered the second one at least.
No, it has, and I think in the spirit of time we can move on, because there's a question I want to go straight back to you with, Harry, just sort of building upon that. So I think you make a super valid point around sort of, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and AI being quite buzzwordy and not necessarily being the solution to every ailment a business would face. I think one of the things I've seen firsthand with businesses looking to roll out solutions, AI or not, is a struggle sometimes to understand whether what they should be doing is sort of identically replicating and digitizing their existing processes versus really reevaluating why they do things in the first place and whether there's an opportunity for process change there. And I think interested in hearing from all three of you, but maybe we start with Harry here. How should businesses, do you think, be thinking about that? And how is there a framework they can apply to sort of help evaluate whether this is something that should just outright be digitized, or whether there's an opportunity to sort of avoid yourself asking for faster horses when someone's selling you cars?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I wouldn't want to advise too much on this from that perspective of working with founders. I'm sure the other two can better advise here with respect to frameworks. But I look back at my days in a corporate. I used to do corporate venturing for Telefonica, and I think often the real challenge here, more so than kind of the end of the road purchasing and procurement of a certain product, was really, I suppose, about internal culture change and how you make it easy as an organization to buy these sorts of products from early stage startups, other suppliers, and how you really set yourself up as an organization to do that well and to do that quickly and to do that with agility. And I think that for me, that was the biggest thing. But I think the other two, I'm sure, have a great input here.
Sure. Mo, any thoughts?
So yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting one. I think the thing here really is to be. I guess I would touch back on what I mentioned earlier. I mean, you need to be transparent, but you need to really take the lead from your users, from your staff, right? And I think that there's a risk, with these sort of projects that you go after the sexy problem rather than the problem that your business actually has. And it's really important to, again, when you embed, one thing that we learned from this kind of startup environment is that when you expose your technical teams to real business problems, that's when you really get going, right? As opposed to trying to kind of impose things sort of top down.
Cool. Simeon, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think I think sometimes the sort of sledgehammer to crack a nut is sort of a good analogy, because I think often organizations don't necessarily always grow organically, some through acquisition, some end up with a whole sort of disarray of different sort of core platforms, some legacy, some not. And rather than go at it, we need to re-platform across the whole architecture. Actually, you can start small, apply different AI techniques, and actually it might just be around some really mundane processes and sort of moving and shifting data from one place to another.
Sure.
And sort of removing the manual effort to do that, removing the spreadsheet, but actually sort of huge benefit to the organization, both in terms of time saving plus data quality and enhancing the sort of end output there. So I think it's sort of around, going back to your sort of question as well around frameworks. I think it's always good to apply a framework, and you may sort of standardize and sort of set out a sort of number of principles within the organization when you embark on a broad AI journey. I think starting small, which sort of Mo mentioned earlier, is sort of really sort of a key to success in my view, and actually not only in actually demonstrating the application of AI, but also then building the trust within the organisation, and actually sort of attracting further investment within the organisation to do more. And I think organisations do need to learn to fail. And I think traditionally within transformation programmes, it's not something that is considered, but given that you're starting small and you're trying out new ideas, there is that opportunity, and organisations should embrace that.
No, that all makes perfect sense. I think building on some of those points, so we've seen some themes kind of come out of this conversation so far, right? So we've talked about specifics, we've talked about macro things, but all of this seems to fundamentally be about change, cultural shifts within the organisation, and sort of rather than this kind of common misconception that AI is about displacing people, it's actually, as Simeon said, it's capacity, right? It's freeing up capacity with those people so they can be deployed more efficiently, more effectively at value add things, and sort of taking pain and unscalable activity away. So that all makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things that we keep coming back to, though, is this notion of people, and we talk a lot when we talk about AI about technology and infrastructure and coding and whatever. I think how can organizations support their people on this transition? What does that look like? Is there training they should be doing? How do organizations A, support the cultural shift required, and B, kind of prepare their people for this change? I think even the laggards in the room really understand that this is an inevitability now. What do they do with their team as they go on this journey? Anyone want to dive in on that one?
Yeah, shall I go for it? Start on that? I think. Sure. Thinking back to this time last year, I was sort of embarking on sort of planning an event. It was a physical event in Jersey, and one of the topics we were going to be considering was the future of work. And just sort of months before the pandemic struck, we were thinking about sort of 3 different themes. So sort of work, the workforce, and the workplace. So work in terms of what sort of things people will be undertaking, sort of both now and in the future. Workplace in terms of where they'll be performing those tasks, and then the workforce in terms of identifying talent and sort of new skills that organisations would need to sort of grow and nurture in order to become digital organisations. And little did we know that actually the whole workplace topic, we're now in a situation where we've got either remote working or hybrid working, and that's here to stay. And then organisations sort of really now need to sort of turn themselves towards, well, how does then work and the workforce evolve through that? So I think training is obviously important. I think developing sort of super teams, I think Mo alluded to this, where actually you start to embed IT individuals, technologists in with the business, and you create these sort of hybrid teams, and that sort of really sort of moves organisations into adopting a sort of very agile approach to how they develop and how they transform, rather than sort of big unwieldy traditional programs which are sort of multi-year in length, high levels of failure, high cost.
Sure.
And I think those super teams then start to learn and evolve. Now, whether that then means that tomorrow's teams are the same, if I take an example of sort of fund accounting, will today's accountant be the same individual that we have tomorrow, or will they have already picked up data science training, and they have a sort of hybrid skill set in the next 5-10 years, whereas at the moment we're sort of meeting those sort of objectives through sort of multiple teams and having people sort of partnering up and sort of working together on solutions.
No, it makes sense, and I think what's interesting from my perspective, just to sort of support that, is I think the world talks a lot at the moment about diversity and inclusion across the board and across the sort of composition of organizations. And I think that's great in terms of gender, ethnicity, and every other kind of characteristic we might think of when we talk about diversity and inclusion. But what's been interesting is really looking at the composition of the board table and looking at how we're seeing the sort of the rise of the chief digital officer and sort of more technically grounded professionals finding a seat at that table and really influencing strategy with a digital lens. And I think everybody knows that really strategy incorporates digital. It's an inevitability, but it's just been interesting to watch from afar organizations sort of change who has the loudest voice in the room and really increasing the engagement with that digital ecosystem. I think, Mo, back to the previous question, what are you guys doing with your team in terms of embracing training and sort of preparing your workforce for this transition?
So we have to take both a short-term and a long-term view when it comes to training. So we're a little bit fortunate, I suppose. So our CEO actually started his career at RBC as a programmer. So I think we're one of the very few kind of large organizations whose chief executive has a technical background itself. And when it comes to looking at kind of how roles will look in the next kind of 5 to 10 years, there's a short-term need around getting people to have better digital skills. So this is primarily kind of being able to interact with newer systems, but also when it comes to surfacing opportunities to our teams to automate them. So we're relying kind of on our operations teams, on our relationship managers, on our trusted administrators as kind of our forward spotters, if you like, to kind of say, hey, that's an interesting process. I think that should be moved to a system, right? Mm-hmm. And because they're the experts, they know the process, they know the data that goes in and out of it, although they may not necessarily think in that. So it's that kind of sort of data-centric thinking that we need to bring in. So we've started with the usual, as most corporations do, kind of online CPT courses. But what we're starting to realize now is that we probably need to be a little bit more structured in this approach. So in the short term, sort of digital skills helps. But when looking at 3 years, 5 years, and then 10 years, we've already started to see some parts of our organization change. So, for example, in the asset management division, we've started to see analysts now being hired with programming skills. And so that's kind of the most kind of data-heavy analysis sort of role. But that's like an interesting indication of how junior roles will change over time. And of course, we're not expecting everyone to become a programmer, but we need everyone to realize kind of what their role is in the sort of digital-centric fact, right? So whether that's being a human in the loop in the system, being able to understand how algorithms work and effectively supervise large-scale systems, everyone will sort of have their role, but we need some time to kind of figure out what training looks like. Some roles will be transformed over time, and it's very important for us to ensure that we're preparing people now. And this is something we're still kind of thinking through. You know, if you know that a particular department will be going through a system change over the next 3 years, what you need to start doing right now is to prepare your people for that, as opposed to doing it like 2 weeks before. Right?
No, sure, and yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it's not about trying to make everybody a programmer, because that's not what these organizations need. It's just about thinking a bit longer term and a bit more strategically about preparing these people for change, and I guess increasing their capacity to adopt and to react to change.
Yeah, we've sort of been through it, right? So if you think about, you know, if you go back 40 years, right, a lot of us didn't do our own typing, right? We give our typing to a pool of typing, typing people to do it. We didn't do our own presentations. We didn't do, we didn't have PowerPoint on the desktop. We'd have a design team do that for us, right?
Yeah.
So there's already been this sort of shift to kind of doing our own IT work. I think that's particularly as programming languages become more accessible, as we get a lot more no-code solutions, we're going to see this sort of gradual shift. And I think our role is actually we don't have to actually do a lot to actively embrace it. We just need to not resist it.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think it does become pervasive across the organisation, but in different ways to different functions. So if you took risk, for example, risk departments now have to deal with sort of new digital risks, both with data, impact of cyber, but also as AI develops, actually, how do they understand what algorithms do? How do they give assurance to those sort of underlying sort of codes? And sort of embed that into their risk framework. So I think the other aspect is probably sort of data, and that most people in the organisation will need to become more familiar with data in terms of how they use that, how they analyse it. And I think we're sort of seeing environmental, social, and governance aspects, ESG, very much sort of being prominent, and particularly in the investment management space, as investors are looking for more ethical investments, organizations then need to respond in terms of how can they actually use their data plus external big data sets to actually start to identify new criteria and sort of new KPIs against which to measure. And I think AI is a great opportunity, not only to sort of provide new insights to old questions, but also new insights to new questions.
Very, very, very eloquently put. I wish I'd thought of that. Last thing to just get some input from Harry on, and then we'll just do one final question, kind of quite topical at the moment. So Harry, just to take the previous question around sort of cultural change and getting teams to be on par and embracing AI. I think obviously you're coming at this from a slightly different perspective and sort of more akin to my own business and my experience. I think I'm interested in understanding that the organizations you're working with, obviously AI is at the core of their business. They're inherently technical. They don't have some of the cultural challenges that Simeon and Mo and sort of the broader marketplace might have here. But how have you seen those challenges come to fruition as those organizations scale and they graduate from sort of a primary technical focused workforce and start introducing and scaling sales and marketing and finance and sort of other operational efforts? Like, how are those businesses ensuring that their team embrace this change at the same rate?
Sure. So I think really, I suppose I think inherent challenges of scaling an AI company. I think inherently these companies are more expensive to build. I think when you think about the talent behind them, you might have a number of PhDs, for example, in a startup. You're potentially trying to hire those people away from Google, Facebook, Amazon, what have you. You have to work with the customer for much longer. I think to really prep on data, the sales cycles are therefore longer. You need to build a relationship over time, and it just takes genuinely longer to productize. You're taking research ultimately and trying to productize that into something that has value for the customer. So I think generally it's much harder to scale an AI company than it is a more generalist software company. So I think that's the challenge that most of these companies are working through before they get to that level of scale where you've sort of built a more productized, systemic way of scaling what you do to different contexts. I think probably on the opposite side, from the corporate perspective, and looking back to my corporate days, it's really how do you make it easy? How do you make it easy as possible to buy from these sort of companies? So doing away with quite lengthy or quite complex procurement systems that are generally in place for larger companies, for example, but might not benefit, say, smaller companies. And as we see a lot of the innovation here driven by those sorts of companies, I think that will become imperative. And making sure that there's really clear paths to sign off, clear timeline put in place, and really working with a lot of these startups, certainly from an AI perspective as a partner. So I think there's really challenges there on both sides, and I think we'll have to become ever more adept, I think, at making those two worlds match up in the coming months and coming years.
Awesome, thank you, Harry. I think I'm going to have to hand back over to Gary very, very shortly because we're short on time. So I'm going to turn what was going to be a very long question into a very short one. One-word answers, please, chaps. COVID, good or bad for the AI landscape?
Opportunity.
That's cheating, but cool. Mo?
Good.
Harry?
I like the word opportunity. I will second that one.
Okay, I'm going to say good. And thank you all for joining us, and over to Gary.
Tom, thank you so much. And I'm very impressed on a yes/no question that at least 50% of a panel actually gave a yes/no answer. That Incredible. Is highly unusual. Another really interesting session looking at the practical applications of AI. And I think one of the recurring themes of the day, no matter how much we talk about technology, it's also about the consideration of the people, whether in the workforce or the end users and customers, and how they're affected by this change as well. So that brings us to the end of our AI session, but it is far from the end of Jersey Tech Week because we've got 3 more days and 6 more sessions to go. Let's take a little look at what's in store for tomorrow then, and let's start off with tomorrow morning's session between 9 and 11, where we're looking at digital health tech transformation. 2 Jersey-based digital health gurus, Andrew Mitchell and Austin Gibbs, will be here giving us a VR view of the world. We'll also hear from Dr. Keith Grimes from Babylon Health, health. We'll be talking about immersive arts, women in health, sandbox Jersey, and so much more besides. And then, as we move into the afternoon, we're looking at islands as a testbed, and so much to talk about, led through the day with Mr. Digital Islands. Joe Dignam will be here. We'll be looking at the creative view of a citizen in a digital world, monetizing infrastructure data, driving economic growth, and ending the day by wrapping up the various loose ends we learned with a really interesting panel discussion. So that is all for tomorrow. As I say every time, if you've missed anything so far, do not worry. Get yourself to the website digital.je/techweek for all the details of the sessions that have gone, to look ahead to the sessions that are still to come. And for now, from me and all the team here, thank you for watching, and join us next time for more from Jersey Tech Week.
you.